Hello, and welcome to Sleepy Time History. Our tagline is, "Not so boring history to help you sleep." Tonight, you're invited to drift into the ancient and modern story of Australia, a land older than memory, yet alive with voices new and old. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Find a comfortable position, put in your earphones, and lower the volume just enough to soften the world outside. Let your shoulders relax. Let your breath deepen, slow and steady like a calm sea brushing a golden shore. As you listen tonight, know that every story you hear is 100% factual, woven from real events, real names, and real moments in time. We are here to help you drift off peacefully while your mind wanders across deserts, rainforests, and the echo of Dreamtime songs under the Southern Cross. If you enjoy our storytelling, please tap like, subscribe to our channel, and share your journey in the comments. Tell us where you're listening from and what time you're settling down. Your support helps us bring more true tales from around the world, one dreamy bedtime story at a time. Now, close your eyes and let's begin the timeless tale of Australia. Tonight, as you close your eyes and settle into the quiet, drift back across an ocean of time, to a land older than any nation you know. Long before maps were drawn, before European sails touched these distant shores, Australia was alive with voices, songlines, and the heartbeat of the Dreamtime. For more than 65,000 years, the first peoples of Australia, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations, lived in deep connection with this land. They are among the world's oldest continuous cultures, passing knowledge through countless generations. They knew the secrets of the seasons, the rivers that flowed in drought, the places where the stars mirrored sacred stories above. Imagine the red sands of the desert glowing in the sun's first light, the green canopies of ancient rainforests, alive with birdsong, the coral reefs glimmering under warm coastal tides. This vast continent held hundreds of nations, each with unique languages, traditions, and spiritual ties to country. In these earliest times, there were no fences or borders in the sense we know today. The people moved with the land, gathering bush tucker, fruits, nuts, seeds, and hunting kangaroo, emu, and fish. Fire was not feared but used wisely to care for the earth, in a practice called fire stick farming, burning small areas to encourage new growth and bring animals closer. Elders told stories of the Dreamtime, the creation time, when ancestral beings shaped the mountains, rivers, plants, and animals. The rainbow serpent, one of the most widely known spirits, carved valleys and waterholes as it slithered across the earth. These stories were not just myths, but living maps and laws, reminding people of their duty to care for each other and the land. Archaeological sites like Majd Beeb in the Northern Territory hold tools and ochre pigments dating back tens of thousands of years. Cave art, some older than the pyramids, depicts animals long extinct and hands pressed against stone, whispers from ancient ancestors who still walk beside their people today. Australia's first peoples thrived despite harsh climates. In the arid center, ingenious wells and underground storage kept communities alive during the long dry. Along the coasts, complex fish traps like those of Brewarina in New South Wales stand as testaments to sophisticated engineering and deep ecological wisdom. Trade routes spanned great distances, carrying ochre, tools, shells, and songs from nation to nation. Connections flowed across the continent like rivers, uniting a patchwork of cultures in shared ceremony and storytelling under endless southern skies. Tonight, as you listen, imagine the soft rustle of possum cloaks, the rhythmic beat of clapsticks, the hush of wind through eucalyptus leaves. Picture elders gathered around a campfire, passing stories to young ones, stories that would live on long after they were gone. For this land was never empty. It was alive with meaning, held by the world's oldest custodians, whose deep time knowledge we still learn from today. And so, with this ancient world in your mind, breathe gently and drift deeper. In the next chapter of our story, sails appear on the horizon, carrying a wave that would forever change this land and its people. But tonight, let the Dreamtime cradle you, and know that beneath Australia's vast skies, these ancient stories still speak. As the Dreamtime whispers settle into the night, a new sound drifts across the horizon, the faint creak of wooden ships, their sails billowing with the winds of discovery, commerce, and empire. The world was changing, and distant explorers were about to cast their eyes upon this ancient continent, setting in motion encounters that would shape Australia's story forever. Long before the British arrived, other seafarers brushed these coasts. Some historians believe that as early as the 15th century, Chinese fleets under Admiral Zhang He may have glimpsed northern shores while sailing the Indian Ocean. But clearer records emerge in the 1600s, when the age of discovery swept European powers far from their homelands in search of new trade routes and lands to claim. In 1606, the first recorded European landing on the Australian mainland occurred when Dutch navigator Willem Janszoon arrived on the western coast of Cape York Peninsula aboard the Duifken. His brief exploration along what he called the New Holland coastline marked the beginning of Dutch mapping efforts in the region. Throughout the 17th century, Dutch explorers charted segments of Australia's rugged western and northern shores. Abel Tasman, whose name echoes in Tasmania, sailed south in 1642, becoming the first known European to reach Van Diemen's Land, today's island state of Tasmania, and parts of New Zealand. Yet the interior remained a mystery, and Europe saw Australia as a distant, inhospitable place. Vast deserts, dangerous reefs, and no gold or spices like those found elsewhere. Other nations joined the map-making. In 1688, the English buccaneer and privateer William Dampier came ashore on Australia's northwest coast, recording harsh landscapes and native flora and fauna that fascinated Europeans. Dampier's journals would later inspire new generations to look upon this great Southland with fresh eyes. By the late 1700s, the winds of empire were blowing strong across the world's oceans. Britain, having lost its American colonies, sought new places for trade, expansion, and convicts. In this shifting tide, one figure stands tall in Australia's European discovery: Captain James Cook. In 1770, Cook, commanding the HMS Endeavour, charted the eastern coastline with remarkable detail. Setting foot at Botany Bay, he and naturalists Joseph Banks and Daniel Solander recorded an astonishing array of plants and animals unknown in Europe. They observed the Guigal people, among the first Aboriginal communities to encounter these newcomers. Though Cook claimed the land for King George III under the doctrine of terra nullius, meaning land belonging to no one, the truth, as we now know, was far different. Cook's meticulous charts and Banks' vivid accounts made their way back to London, capturing the imagination of a nation ready to expand its empire once more. Here was a place far enough away to solve the problem of overflowing prisons at home, and perhaps, one day, a gateway to the wealth of the Pacific and Asia. While the first peoples continued to live by songlines and seasons, the seeds of colonization were sown. The great ships of Europe would soon bring settlers, convicts, and soldiers, and along with them, profound upheaval. Yet amid this looming transformation, the coasts remained wild and largely unexplored. Many dangers awaited: hidden reefs that wrecked ships, scorching deserts that defied exploration, and inland rivers that meandered into the unknown. Even so, the age of European exploration brought not just maps and claims but exchanges of curiosity and wonder. Strange creatures, the kangaroo, the platypus, baffled European scientists. Botanical specimens filled London's Kew Gardens, and stories of the southern skies fed dreams of new beginnings and empire. For the aboriginal nations, these sails on the horizon foreshadowed unimaginable challenges ahead. The Dreamtime's balance would be tested by smallpox, dispossession, and laws made far away in London's marble halls. Tonight, let your mind drift with those first ships along the rugged coasts. Hear the slap of sails, the creak of masts, the cautious footsteps of sailors peering into a world they did not understand. In the chapters to come, you'll hear how these early landings turned into a colony, and how a continent was forever changed by the tide of empire. Breathe deeply, and as the old world meets the new, drift further into sleep's embrace. As your mind drifts along the edges of this ancient land, picture now the rising swell of waves and the muffled shouts of sailors bracing for a new chapter. It is 1787, and in the dockyards of Portsmouth, England, 11 ships creak under the weight of supplies, soldiers, sailors, and hundreds of convicts bound for a place few in Britain truly knew. This would become known as the First Fleet, a fleet that carried the seeds of modern Australia's European settlement, and the beginning of a story marked by hardship, survival, and irreversible change for the continent's first peoples. After the loss of the American colonies, Britain's prisons were overflowing. Petty crimes, stealing bread, a bolt of cloth, often meant a sentence of transportation across the seas. For the British government, sending convicts to the new land Cook had charted seemed practical, out of sight, and a foothold for expanding empire in the Pacific. Commanded by Captain Arthur Phillip, the First Fleet set sail in May 1787. On board were about 1,400 people: sailors, marines, officials, and nearly 750 convicts, including men, women, and children. They faced an 8-month voyage across 24,000 kilometers of storm-tossed seas. Below decks, the convicts lay chained in cramped holds, surviving on salted meat and hardtack, plagued by disease and fear of the unknown. At last, in January 1788, they sighted the rugged coastline of New South Wales. Philip first anchored at Botany Bay, the site Cook had recommended, but found its waters shallow and the soil unsuitable for crops. He moved the fleet northward to Port Jackson, where they discovered a deep, sheltered harbor with fresh water and fertile land. This natural cove would become Sydney Cove, and the site of the first European settlement on the continent. On January 26, 1788, the Union Jack was raised at Sydney Cove, marking the beginning of the penal colony that would grow into modern Sydney. Today, that date is commemorated as Australia Day, But for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, it is a day of mourning, known as Invasion Day, remembering the dispossession and suffering that followed. Life in the fledgling settlement was brutal. The land was beautiful yet unforgiving to newcomers who knew little of its rhythms. Crops failed, tools broke, and rations dwindled. Convicts labored under harsh discipline, clearing forests, building rough huts, and carving out roads and farms from the bush. Yet they were not alone. The Eora Nation, whose lands encompassed Sydney, watched these strangers with wary eyes. Early encounters were tense and sometimes violent, though some individuals, like the famed Bennelong, became vital intermediaries between cultures. Bennelong even traveled to England with Governor Phillip in 1792, becoming one of the first Aboriginal Australians to visit Europe. For many Aboriginal communities, the arrival of the First Fleet brought devastating impacts. Introduced diseases like smallpox ravaged the population, spreading faster than European settlers themselves. Traditional lands were seized for farms and settlements, disrupting food sources, sacred sites, and cultural ties. Despite the hardships, the colony endured. Philip's leadership, though strict, helped stabilize the settlement. He worked to ensure fair treatment of both convicts and local Aboriginal people, but the collision of two vastly different worlds would lead to conflicts that stretched for decades. Convicts who survived their sentences were often granted small plots of land, becoming farmers themselves. Former soldiers and free settlers arrived in growing numbers, drawn by the promise of cheap land and new beginnings. By the early 1800s, Sydney had outgrown its origins as a rough penal outpost and was becoming a bustling port town. The young colony expanded outward, pushing against the Blue Mountains that loomed to the west. For years, these rugged peaks defied exploration, acting as a natural barrier to the interior's secrets. But in 1813, explorers Blaxland, Lawson, and Wentworth succeeded in crossing the mountains, opening a path to the vast plains beyond. This breakthrough would ignite waves of pastoral expansion, sheep and cattle grazing lands stretching ever deeper into country, reshaping the landscape and lives of the First Nations. As the colony grew, so too did its stories, of bushrangers and escaped convicts turned outlaws, of settlers carving homesteads from wild scrub, of Aboriginal resistance and resilience in the face of invasion. And all the while, the songs of the Dreamtime still whispered in the wind, carried on the land's ancient breath, even as fences rose and towns spread across the bush. Tonight, as you listen, imagine the rough wooden huts of early Sydney, the crackle of campfires along the shore, the uneasy silence between settlers and the people who had called this land home for millennia. Picture the endless ocean behind them and an endless continent before, a place that would test them, break some, and transform all. Breathe deeply, and know that this is only the beginning of Australia's colonial story. A story that will grow into gold rushes, rebellion, federation, and a nation still finding its way to reconcile past and present. Sleep now, with the First Fleet sails fading into the dusk of your mind. When you wake, we'll walk deeper inland, following the footsteps of those who dreamed of a new life on this ancient land. Drift deeper now, as the faint glow of Sydney Cove's fires flickers behind us. The years pass like a soft breeze, carrying whispers of settlers, soldiers, convicts turned free men, all looking inland, beyond the coastal cliffs and towering blue mountains. In this chapter, Australia's story pushes outward, driven by curiosity, ambition, and a hunger for new lands. After Blaxland, Lawson, and Wentworth's breakthrough crossing of the Blue Mountains in 1813, a whole new chapter of exploration began. To the Europeans, this was terra incognita, but to the hundreds of First Nations living there, it was country, ancient and known, crisscrossed with songlines and stories older than any map. With the mountain barrier breached, Governor Lachlan Macquarie ordered the construction of a road over the ridge, connecting Sydney to the Bathurst Plains. This feat, built by convict road gangs in harsh conditions, opened vast grazing lands for sheep and cattle, a commodity that would make the young colony wealthy in wool exports. Throughout the early 1800s, explorers fanned out like rivers from the coast. Men like Hamilton Hume and William Hovell traced river valleys into Victoria, while Charles Sturt famously traced the course of the Murray and Darling rivers, unlocking a watery highway that would feed the new settlements. But this push inland, this hunger for land, brought the settlers into increasing conflict with the first peoples who had cared for these landscapes for millennia. The frontier wars, as they're now called, were not always declared wars in the European sense, but they were fierce and tragic nonetheless. Small groups of squatters, settlers who claimed huge tracts of land, often without official permission, pushed deeper into country. They built fences, cleared forests, and diverted rivers, disrupting hunting grounds and sacred sites. Aboriginal resistance took many forms: spears and fire, protests and raids on homesteads. In turn, settlers often retaliated with brutal violence. One of the darkest examples is the Myall Creek Massacre of 1838 in northern New South Wales, where at least 28 Wurundjeri people, mostly women and children, were killed by stockmen. This atrocity was unusual not because of the violence, sadly common on the frontier, but because the perpetrators were tried and hanged in Sydney, a rare moment of colonial law acknowledging the humanity of Aboriginal people. Despite moments of justice, the tide of expansion rolled on. By the mid-1800s, sheep stations stretched across New South Wales, Victoria, and into South Australia. Towns sprang up beside rivers and crossroads, rough pubs, blacksmiths, post offices, each new settlement a mark of colonial ambition and indigenous dispossession. Meanwhile, the harsh interior continued to lure and confound explorers. Edward John Eyre, driven by youthful determination, became the first European to cross from South Australia to Western Australia in the 1840s, surviving blistering deserts and salt pans with the help of Aboriginal guides. Not all explorers were so fortunate. The tragic tale of Burke and Wills still echoes across the continent. In 1860, Robert O'Hara Burke and William John Wills led an expedition from Melbourne north to the Gulf of Carpentaria, nearly 3,000 kilometers through some of the harshest land on Earth. Though they reached the Gulf, they found themselves stranded on the return journey. Ill-prepared and ignoring local knowledge, they perished along Cooper Creek, just one example of how survival often depended on listening to those who knew the land best. As more land was claimed and more fences hammered into the soil, Aboriginal people were forced onto missions and reserves. Some communities resisted openly, others found ways to adapt, working as stockmen and laborers on cattle stations, keeping culture alive in quiet pockets of country. Yet even amid this era of displacement, new Australian identities were forming. The rugged stockman on horseback became a folk hero, celebrated in bush ballads and campfire tales. The vast landscape inspired poets and artists, weaving a mythology of mateship, survival, and the unbreakable bond between people and this ancient land. Tonight, let your mind wander over these vast plains. Imagine the endless grasslands under a southern moon, the distant bark of dingoes, the footsteps of explorers, and the silent watching eyes of those who knew the land far better than any map could show. In the next chapter, this continent of wide horizons will be shaken by gold, a rush that would draw fortune seekers from every corner of the globe and sow the seeds for a nation to come. But for now, breathe gently. Let the ghosts of explorers, stockmen, and warriors drift past, their stories tangled in the wind, as you sink deeper into sleep's embrace. Let your mind drift now to the mid-1800s, a time when the whisper of gold in the earth set hearts pounding and feet marching. The continent's interior, once seen by many colonists as harsh and unforgiving, suddenly shimmered with promise, a land of golden dreams that would change Australia forever. It began in 1851, when Edward Hargreaves, an adventurer inspired by the California gold rush, found gold near Bathurst in New South Wales. Almost overnight, news spread like wildfire. Men abandoned farms, shops, and ships to swarm the goldfields, picks and pans slung over their shoulders, hopes as bright as the nuggets they sought. Gold was soon found in Victoria too, at Ballarat and Bendigo, places that would become legendary in Australia's gold rush folklore. By the end of the decade, tens of thousands of prospectors, known as diggers, poured in from Britain, Ireland, China, Europe, and America. Victoria's population exploded, transforming Melbourne from a modest port town into one of the richest cities in the British Empire. The goldfields were rough and rowdy places. Tents and shanties sprawled across muddy ground. Fortunes were made and lost overnight. Many who found no gold found opportunity in selling supplies, sly grog, tools, and food to hungry diggers dreaming of striking it rich. Among the new arrivals were thousands of Chinese miners, whose hard work and different customs often sparked resentment and tension. Racism flared in the goldfields, leading to discriminatory taxes and violent clashes, a foreshadowing of the White Australia policy that would shape the nation's immigration laws for decades. It wasn't just fortune seekers who flocked to the diggings. Officials arrived too, demanding licenses and fees from miners who felt the weight of unfair taxation. Tensions simmered until they boiled over in one of the defining moments of Australia's early democracy, the Eureka Stockade. In 1854, at Ballarat, frustrated miners rose up against colonial authorities. Their protest was about more than gold. It was about representation, fairness, and the right to have a say in the laws that governed their hard, dangerous lives. They built a crude stockade, raised the blue and white Eureka flag, a symbol of rebellion, and stood their ground. On December 3rd, government troops stormed the stockade. In the brief but bloody clash, over 20 miners and a handful of soldiers were killed. Though the rebellion was crushed, the legacy of the Eureka Stockade lived on. The miners' demands for fairer treatment sparked political reforms, giving birth to more democratic institutions in the colonies. The gold rush also accelerated the dispossession of Aboriginal peoples. New settlements sprawled across the land, rivers were poisoned by mining runoff, and ancient sites were destroyed. Some indigenous communities found work as trackers and guides, but many were pushed further from their ancestral homes. Yet the rush for gold brought more than conflict. It brought a new spirit of multiculturalism and invention. In the bustling towns of Ballarat and Bendigo, Chinese migrants established vibrant communities, building temples, gardens, and networks that endure today. The newfound wealth funded grand buildings, railways, and telegraph lines. Melbourne, dubbed Marvelous Melbourne, gleamed with theaters, banks, and hotels, its skyline a testament to dreams made real by gold. Not everyone found fortune. For many diggers, the gold fields ended in poverty and disappointment. But some took up farming or opened businesses, laying foundations for the growing colonies. In this swirl of pickaxes and protest, wealth and ruin, a sense of Australian identity began to take shape, a larrikin spirit that prized mateship, fair play, and a suspicion of authority. Legends of the bushranger also grew from these times. Figures like Ned Kelly, the ironclad outlaw, would become icons of defiance against what many saw as unfair rule. As you rest, picture the flickering campfires of the goldfields, the clang of hammers on rock, the hush of voices telling tall tales under the southern stars. Imagine the Eureka flag rippling in the night breeze, a banner for the restless dream of freedom and fairness that still threads through Australia's story. The gold rush would fade, but its legacy endured, filling the young colony's coffers, attracting people from every corner of the globe, and planting seeds of democracy and rebellion that would grow stronger with time. In our next chapter, we will see these scattered colonies draw closer together. For there would come a time when the people of this vast continent would decide to join as one nation. But for now, drift gently among the gold dust. Let the hammering of picks fade into your dreams, and know that even the richest veins could not outshine the ancient spirit of this land. As you breathe softly now, picture the scattered colonies that spanned this sunburnt continent in the late 1800s. 6 separate colonies, each with its own government, its own railways and postal services, its own pride and stubbornness. New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia, and Tasmania. Separate yet bound together by geography and a growing sense of shared identity. The gold rushes and expanding wool industry had made many cities wealthy. Melbourne glistened with new buildings, Sydney buzzed with trade, Adelaide flourished under free settlers' careful planning. Yet the colonies were divided by more than just distance. Different rail gauges meant trains stopped at borders. Trade tariffs sparked rivalries and made moving goods expensive and slow. Bushrangers and petty border disputes were constant worries. But underneath these practical frustrations beat a restless desire for unity, and a growing recognition that if these colonies did not stand together, they might stand alone and vulnerable. In Europe, imperial powers were carving up Africa and the Pacific. Rumors swirled of German and French interests eyeing the region. Australia's leaders realized that a single continent-wide government could better defend its shores and manage immigration, trade, and foreign relations. Through the final decades of the 19th century, talk of federation grew louder. Visionaries like Sir Henry Parkes, the father of federation, made impassioned speeches about the need for the colonies to unite. In his famous Tenterfield oration of 1889, Parkes declared, "The great question which we have to consider is whether the time has not now arisen for the creation, on this Australian continent, of an Australian government. Not everyone agreed. There were deep divisions between colonies, big and small, rich and poor. Smaller colonies feared being dominated by powerful New South Wales or wealthy Victoria. Rivalries simmered, yet a common identity, the feeling of being Australian, was taking root. Draft conventions and referendums followed. Men, and only men, at first, debated the shape of a federal parliament, how to balance the rights of states with the need for a strong central government. Ordinary people debated too, in pubs, churches, newspapers, and town halls. Finally, in 1900, after years of heated discussion, the draft constitution was approved by the British Parliament and signed into law by Queen Victoria. On January 1, 1901, the 6 colonies became states of a new nation, the Commonwealth of Australia. A huge celebration marked the moment in Centennial Park, Sydney. Banners fluttered, brass bands played, and people cheered as Edmund Barton was sworn in as the first Prime Minister. Federation did not magically erase all differences, but it laid the foundations for the modern nation. One flag, one defense force, one seat at the table of nations. Yet, this new Australia was still deeply unequal. Women in South Australia and Western Australia had already won the right to vote before Federation, but it would take until 1902 for women nationwide to gain that right in federal elections, one of the first countries in the world to grant this. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, however, were left out entirely, denied citizenship, voting rights, and recognition in the new constitution. In these early years, a defining policy would also emerge, the White Australia policy. It restricted non-European immigration and shaped the nation's identity for decades, limiting the dreams of thousands who had come from China and the Pacific Islands during the gold rush and sugar plantation days. Despite these shadows, the new Commonwealth set out to build a national story. Rail lines would stretch across the Nullarbor Plain, connecting east and west. A new capital city, Canberra, was planned as a compromise between Sydney and Melbourne. And Australia's soldiers, or diggers, would soon make their mark far from home, on battlefields that would forge a deeper sense of what it meant to be Australian. In 1914, just over a decade after Federation, the First World War erupted. When Britain declared war on Germany, Australia, as part of the empire, joined without hesitation. Young men, many barely out of school, enlisted in droves, fired by loyalty and adventure. They would become the Anzacs, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, whose sacrifice at Gallipoli in 1915 would etch a legend into the nation's heart. Though the campaign was a military failure, the courage and mateship shown on those rugged cliffs gave birth to the Anzac spirit, a story retold every year on Anzac Day, when dawn services across the country honor the fallen. Back home, the war strained the young nation. Thousands never returned, and the grief lingered in every small town and outback homestead. Yet, out of that sacrifice grew a stronger sense of unity, a people tested by hardship, determined to shape their own future. As you drift into your dreams tonight, picture the new flag fluttering over a continent once divided by rivers and rivalries. Imagine the dusty meetings in town halls where voices argued over how to share power. Picture the wide-eyed boys boarding ships for Gallipoli, believing they were fighting for king and country, and for an Australia that was still learning what it would become. When you wake, we'll travel deeper into the 20th century, through depressions and wars, migration waves and modern reckonings, a journey of a nation still discovering itself, step by step under the Southern Cross. Sleep now, wrapped in the stories of federation and the promise of a land united. Settle in. Breathe slowly. Let your body sink deeper into the warmth of your bed as we drift into a time of shifting tides, the Australia of the 1970s and 80s. The sun rose on a country both familiar and restless. After decades of quiet routines, white picket fences, and backyard barbecues under the southern stars, something was stirring in the suburbs and cities. A generation was ready to ask questions, to open doors that had long been closed. In 1972, the Labour Party, led by the charismatic and visionary Gough Whitlam, swept into power. His government promised bold reform, an end to the old conservative order, and a chance to redefine Australia's place in the world. Imagine the hope that surged through the nation as people watched Whitlam's government dismantle the remnants of the White Australia policy, opening migration even wider to the world. More Vietnamese families arrived, seeking refuge from war. Greek and Italian communities grew stronger, building churches, corner shops, and neighborhoods that smelled of garlic, basil, and fresh bread. In small town halls and urban centers, women's groups gathered to push for equal pay, reproductive rights, and better access to education. The feminist movement was no longer just a whisper, it was a steady drumbeat that echoed through schools, workplaces, and the halls of Parliament. At the same time, Aboriginal voices rose louder than ever. The Aboriginal Tent Embassy, first erected on the lawns of Parliament House in 1972, became a potent symbol. 4 young men sitting on the grass with a beach umbrella, declaring that they were ambassadors for their own sovereign nation, right in the heart of Canberra. The Tent Embassy, battered by police, rebuilt again and again, stood as a testament to a people who would not be silenced. Imagine the conversations whispered late at night in family kitchens, about land rights, about whether Australia should stay tied to Britain's monarchy, about how to face the shadows of the past. While these conversations played out, everyday life ticked on. In suburban streets, Holden cars sat parked in driveways. The smell of sausages on the barbie drifted through warm summer evenings. Kids rode rusty BMX bikes down dusty streets, skin browned by the relentless sun. The 1970s were also the age of TV. More homes flicked on black and white screens to watch Countdown, a new show that turned local rock bands into legends. Young Aussies swooned over sherbet, skyhooks, and later, the early days of AC/DC. Music festivals popped up in grassy fields, teenagers shoulder to shoulder under starlit skies, chanting lyrics that felt like freedom. But the winds of hope met stormy waters. Whitlam's ambitious reforms ran into political and economic roadblocks. In 1975, Australia faced its most dramatic constitutional crisis when the Governor-General, Sir John Kerr, dismissed Whitlam's government, a shock that left the nation stunned and divided. Some called it a coup, others called it necessary. Even today, historians debate whether that day changed Australia's trust in its own democracy forever. Into the 1980s, the country sought to heal and grow. A new leader, Bob Hawke, rose from the ranks of union halls, a silver-haired larrikin whose tearful promises on national TV made him feel like one of the people. Hawke's government pushed Australia further into the global economy. floating the Australian dollar, deregulating banks, and forging new trade ties with Asia. With this shift came a fresh wave of opportunity and unease. Farmers and factory workers worried about foreign competition. Young professionals flocked to cities like Sydney and Melbourne, where skyscrapers rose like steel saplings, casting long shadows over old Victorian terraces. Through it all, culture blossomed. Aussie cinema had its golden moment. Filmmakers like Peter Weir, George Miller, and Gillian Armstrong turned local stories into international hits. Think of Mel Gibson, a young unknown, racing across the outback in Mad Max. Think of the haunting Outback Tale picnic at Hanging Rock, where schoolgirls vanish into the bush, never to be seen again. A story that captured the unsettling beauty and mystery of the land. Sports, too, held the nation's heart. The cricket pitch, the rugby field, the surf breaking over golden beaches, they were stages where working-class heroes became household names. Kids in dusty towns dreamed of playing for the baggy green, of hearing their names called at the MCG as crowds roared like ocean surf. The 1980s also saw the rise of environmental voices. Protests erupted over the damming of Tasmania's Franklin River, a battle that brought together students, farmers, artists, and politicians, all fighting to save a wild, untamed stretch of water and forest. Out of these protests, Australia's green politics took root, growing into a powerful movement that would shape future debates on climate change and conservation. And always, the struggle for Indigenous rights pressed forward. Elders spoke at rallies, young activists wrote poetry, painted murals, and sang songs that carried their message across the continent. The battle for land rights, self-determination, and recognition refused to fade. It only grew stronger with each generation. At night, families sat on creaky couches under slow ceiling fans, watching news of miners' strikes and debates over uranium exports. Mums and dads whispered about rising mortgages, about kids moving to the city, about what the future might hold. And under it all, the ancient land remained. The same desert winds blowing across Uluru, the same gum trees standing sentry along creeks and paddocks, the same spirits of the dreaming humming softly, waiting to be heard. As you drift deeper into your dreams, imagine the Australia of the 70s and 80s, an island continent shedding old skin, yet holding tight to the threads that make its story so rich and layered. Picture the bright surfboards lined up on Bondi Beach, the miners' lanterns flickering in dark tunnels, the school kids scribbling essays about the tent embassy they'd visited on a field trip. This is the story of a country forever questioning, what does it mean to be Australian? Who gets to belong? Whose voices are still waiting to be heard? And even now, decades later, those questions linger, like the wattle blossoms after a spring storm, or the soft hush of the bush at dusk. So rest easy. The journey is not over yet, and the next dawn brings new voices, new dreams, and new paths forward. Take a slow, deep breath. Let your shoulders drop as we travel back to the decades after the Second World War, when Australia was reimagining itself with every passing year. The war had left scars on the world, deep ones. But it also brought Australia closer to its neighbors, closer to America, and more distant from its old identity as a far-flung outpost of the British Empire. When peace returned, so did the soldiers. They stepped off ships and trains, boots dusty, hearts both hopeful and heavy. Many carried memories of Kokoda's muddy trails, of desert sieges in North Africa, of nights spent watching the sky over Europe burn red with fire. They came home to a country ready to build, and build they did. Between 1945 and 1970, Australia's population nearly doubled. An ambitious post-war immigration program opened the doors wide, welcoming not only the British but displaced families from Eastern Europe, the Mediterranean, and later, Asia. Ships crossed oceans carrying young couples clutching suitcases, children peering wide-eyed from deck rails as they glimpsed the sprawling coastline for the first time. They arrived with broken English, calloused hands, and big dreams. In suburbs sprouting around cities like Melbourne, Sydney, and Adelaide, these new Australians unpacked trunks of memories. Greek matriarchs planted olive trees beside fibro cottages. Italian fathers paved driveways by hand and taught their sons the old recipes. The aroma of garlic, oregano, and simmering tomatoes drifted through streets once lined with plain meat pies and lamingtons. In these new neighborhoods, small migrant groceries sold jars of pickled peppers and hanging salami next to shelves of Weet-Bix and Vegemite. Australia's palate was changing, but so too was its sense of itself. The 1950s and 60s brought the baby boom. Hospitals overflowed with newborns. Schools sprang up on farmland turned into tidy cul-de-sacs. Hills hoists twirled in backyards dotted with swing sets and barking dogs. The Holden car became a national icon, families piling in for Sunday drives, windows rolled down to catch the warm breeze scented with eucalyptus. Television flickered into living rooms, black and white at first, a new window to the world. Children gathered cross-legged to watch Skippy the bush kangaroo, bellbird, and grainy cricket matches beamed from the MCG. Through these screens, they glimpsed the changing world. Civil rights marches in the U.S., the Beatles landing in Adelaide to a screaming sea of teenagers, the dawn of man walking on the moon. But under the smooth hum of progress, the tensions of a young nation were growing. Australia still clung to the White Australia policy, a contradiction in a country built on migration. Many who arrived from southern Europe faced suspicion, jokes about their accents, slurs whispered at work, or muttered over backyard fences. Yet, these same communities planted roots that would transform the nation's culture, food, music, and future. For Indigenous Australians, this was still an era of struggle, a harsh fight for recognition, equality, and dignity. Imagine the quiet courage of Aboriginal families forced off traditional lands into missions and reserves. Children, part of the stolen generations, taken from mothers' arms, placed in church-run institutions or fostered out to white families, their language and stories stripped away. And yet, resilience. Through whispered dreaming stories, through songs hummed under breath, through elders who remembered and taught, the oldest living cultures on Earth survived the coldest of policies. By the late 1960s, a new awareness spread. In 1967, over 90% of Australians voted in a landmark referendum to count Aboriginal people in the census, a symbolic but powerful step towards greater recognition. The post-war boom wasn't just about houses and cars. It was about ideas, new ideas of fairness, identity, and place in the world. Australia also looked north and saw Asia as more than just the other. The Vietnam War tested this view. Young Australian soldiers, conscripted through the controversial lottery system, found themselves fighting in jungles far from the cricket fields of home. Many returned scarred, physically and mentally, to a society still learning how to care for its veterans. As the 70s dawned, the children of the baby boomers were growing up. They marched against war, sang songs of protest, and sat cross-legged at university lawns, debating whether their country should cling to old certainties or forge its own voice. In the outer suburbs, mums stitched school uniforms on Singer machines while dads coached weekend footy games under the hot sun. On Sunday mornings, the family would gather around the kitchen table, the radio humming with Blue Hills or the horse races from Flemington. In the outback, the Royal Flying Doctor Service buzzed over vast distances, bringing medicine and comfort to stations hours from the nearest town. And in remote communities, Aboriginal families hunted kangaroo and gathered bush tucker, living the old ways alongside the new, navigating policies that often spoke for them but rarely with them. It was a time of contradictions, immense pride in being the lucky country, but also quiet reckonings about what that luck cost and who was left behind. Culture blossomed in unexpected corners. Painters like Albert Namatjira captured the red heart of the land in watercolors that felt like soft prayers. Writers like Patrick White, who would go on to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, challenged readers to see the Australian landscape as more than just backdrop, but as a character, alive and demanding. Sport stitched the nation together too. The 1956 Melbourne Olympics placed Australia firmly on the world stage. Young swimmers like Dawn Fraser cutting through the pool like human torpedoes, while the country cheered from lounge rooms and local pubs. Small towns and big cities felt a surge of pride, a belief that this island continent at the edge of the world could punch above its weight. And yet, through it all, the question echoed: who are we, really? A British outpost? An Asian neighbor? A mosaic of migrants? The ancient home of the oldest cultures known to humankind? Perhaps it was all of these, woven together in a patchwork that only made sense when you stepped back and saw the whole. So, as you lie here drifting off, imagine the scenes. Children chasing footballs across paddocks under vast, cloudless skies. Newly arrived migrants planting lemon trees in clay soil. Elders tracing song lines under the brilliant stars of the Southern Cross. The Australia that rose from the ashes of war was not perfect, far from it. But it was alive with possibility, stitched together with hope, sacrifice, and the promise that each generation would ask better questions and dream bigger dreams. Rest now. There's more to this story yet. More rivers to cross, more voices to hear, more truths to hold gently in the quiet of the night. Settle deeper into your pillow. Let your breathing slow, in and out like gentle ocean waves lapping the golden sands of Bondi or Cotswold. As you drift further into sleep, we move into Australia's more recent past, a time of breathtaking growth, spirited debate, and small steps towards healing old wounds. It is the 1990s. The Cold War has ended. The world seems to be opening up, like a door that had been stuck for decades. Australia, too, stands on the threshold of change. The Hawke government gives way to Paul Keating, a leader with a biting wit and a vision for a modern nation unshackled from its colonial shadows. Keating's Australia is more assertive in Asia, more confident in its multicultural skin, and more willing to confront uncomfortable truths. One of those truths is the treatment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. For too long, their stories had been buried under official histories, but in the 1990s, the ground began to shift. Picture a sunlit afternoon in 1992. At Redfern Park in Sydney, Prime Minister Keating steps up to a microphone. His words cut through the summer air. We committed the murders. We took the children from their mothers. We practiced discrimination and exclusion. His speech is raw, honest, and for many, the first time they hear a national leader speak openly about the painful truth of dispossession. This was the same decade that saw the landmark Mabwa decision. In 1992, the High Court recognized native title for the first time, overturning the lie of Terran Elias, the claim that the continent had belonged to no one before British settlement. The fight led by Eddie Mabwa, a humble Torres Strait Islander from Mare Island, changed Australian law forever. Imagine families sitting around TV sets, seeing Mabwa's name on the news, hearing elders whisper that maybe, just maybe, the land could finally speak for them once more. The 90s were not just about reckoning with the past. They were years of booming cities, the rise of the internet, and a new wave of cultural confidence. Sydney began preparing for the 2000 Olympic Games, its skyline bristling with cranes and fresh ambition. People around the world watched Australia's athletes train under the punishing sun, dreams of gold medals shining as brightly as the Southern Cross. In offices and bedrooms, dial-up modems buzzed and beeped. A new generation of young Aussies logged onto chat rooms, discovering a world far beyond their sunburnt shores. Across multicultural suburbs, kids with Lebanese, Vietnamese, Greek, and Chinese heritage played cricket in driveways, their accents blending the old with the new. Their parents worked in corner stores, takeaway shops, and taxi ranks, building small fortunes brick by brick. Meanwhile, Aboriginal artists and musicians carried their stories into the mainstream. Bands like Yothu indie mixed rock and traditional Yolngu sounds, singing anthems of pride and protest. Their song Treaty was more than a hit, it was a rallying cry, a call for promises to be kept. In 1997, the Bringing Them Home report told heartbreaking stories of the stolen generations. The nation listened as elders described being ripped from their mothers, raised in dormitories far from the red earth of their ancestors. Cries for an apology grew louder. It would come, but not yet. As the new millennium dawned, Australia's cities glowed with fireworks and optimism. The Sydney Olympics in 2000 became a celebration of who Australia was and could be. Kathy Freeman, a proud Kuku Yalanji and Barry Gubba woman, sprinted barefoot through history, lighting the Olympic cauldron and winning gold before a roaring crowd. For millions, she was proof that the oldest living cultures on Earth still shone bright, carrying ancient stories into the future. But the 2000s also brought fresh tensions. In 2001, the world changed overnight with the September 11th attacks. Global fear and suspicion seeped into Australian politics too. The Tampa affair tested the nation's heart. A Norwegian freighter rescued 438 asylum seekers from a sinking Indonesian fishing boat. As debate raged, Australia's government, led by John Howard, refused to let the ship dock. Some praised the tough stance, others wept at the images of desperate families stranded at sea. Through the decade, the mining boom transformed towns into bustling outposts. Fly-in fly-out workers traveled thousands of kilometers to dig iron ore and coal from the red soil, fueling an economy that seemed unstoppable. Suburban streets filled with new 4WDs and backyard pools, while property prices in Sydney and Melbourne soared. In the outback, traditional owners continued their fight for land rights, facing new challenges as mines pushed deeper into country that held sacred stories and burial sites. Technology knitted the country closer to the world. Young people downloaded music, texted friends, and dreamed of backpacking through Europe or Asia. Universities swelled with international students, bright minds from China, India, and Malaysia who came to study in Perth, Brisbane, Adelaide. Yet, even in this swirl of modernity, the land remained ancient. Bushfires raged hotter and more frequent, reminders that this continent is both a cradle and a crucible. In 2008, a long-awaited moment arrived. On a clear February morning, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd stood before Parliament and the nation. With a voice that cracked with emotion, he said the words so many had waited for: "Sorry." It was an apology to the stolen generations, to mothers who never saw their babies again, to children who grew up searching for faces that looked like theirs. Crowds gathered outside Parliament House, some weeping, some holding photos of ancestors who never lived to hear those words. This was not the end of the struggle, but it was a step towards healing, towards a more honest reckoning with history. As you drift further into sleep, picture Australia in these years. High-rise towers glittering over Sydney Harbour. Kids kicking footies on dusty ovals in Alice Springs. Elders sitting beneath ghost gums, telling stories of the dreaming as the Milky Way spins overhead. This is the Australia of reconciliation and resistance, of booming cities and timeless bush. A land where new migrants, First Nations peoples, and descendants of convicts and settlers all walk under the same blazing sun, asking, "What comes next?" Rest easy, dreamer. Our journey is not done. The final chapters of this tale still unfold under the southern stars. Sink deeper into your blanket now. Listen to the quiet hum of your breath. Let it steady your mind as we walk gently into the Australia of today, a nation still young, still reckoning, still dreaming. Picture the skyline of Sydney at dusk, the sails of the Opera House glowing soft white, the harbour bridge strung with lights like a silver necklace. Ferries glide across the inky water as workers head home to bustling suburbs filled with more languages than one can easily count. This is modern Australia, diverse, proud, and paradoxical. In the 2010s, Australia faced the world as a confident middle power. Its cities grew into thriving multicultural hubs. Walk down a street in Melbourne's Footscray, Sydney's Parramatta, or Brisbane's Sunnybank and you'll hear Vietnamese, Greek, Hindi, Mandarin, Italian, all spoken alongside the classic Aussie drawl. People from more than 200 birthplaces now call this land home. 1 in every 4 Australians was born overseas, a remarkable testament to a country once defined by the White Australia policy, now replaced by a mosaic of cultures that flavor the food, music, politics, and everyday life. You might taste Lebanon in the baklava from a suburban bakery, or the flavors of Ethiopia in a cafe tucked beside a train station. Indian grocers stand beside old Aussie pubs. Mosques rise near weatherboard churches. Yet, even in this open embrace, Australia struggles with old shadows. The First Nations peoples, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, continue their journey for recognition and justice. Decades of reports, apologies, and parliamentary motions have not yet closed the life expectancy gap or ended the cycle of disadvantage. Deaths in custody, stolen wages, and fights for sacred sites still make headlines. And yet, the resilience remains. From Arnhem Land to the Kimberley, from Redfern to Yoruba, elders teach the young ones language, dance, and songlines that carry stories older than the pyramids. Art blooms in dot paintings, bark art, and powerful political works that hang in galleries from Darwin to New York. In 2017, a new milestone appeared on the horizon, the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Gathered at the red heart of the continent, hundreds of First Nations leaders called for a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament, a way for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to advise lawmakers on issues affecting their communities. The call was simple yet profound. We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. Australia now stands on the cusp of deciding whether to walk through that door together. In the wider world, climate change cast a long shadow. Australia, with its fragile ecosystems and fire-prone bush, felt the sting keenly. Think back to the summer of 2019 and 2020, the Black Summer, when flames roared across mountains and forests. An estimated 3 billion animals perished or were displaced. Koalas, their fur singed, clung to charred tree trunks. Towns like Cobargo and Malakuta turned into scenes from an apocalypse. Families huddled on beaches, watching ember storms swirl overhead. Amid the smoke and fear, stories of courage flickered. Volunteer firefighters who battled the flames for weeks on end, strangers who opened their homes to the displaced, communities that rose again from the ashes, rebuilding hall by hall, street by street. These fires, more frequent and ferocious, remind Australia of its delicate balance with the land, and the enduring wisdom of First Nations fire management, cool burns practiced for millennia to nurture country. Then came 2020, a year the world will not soon forget. The COVID-19 pandemic shut borders, emptied airports, and turned cities into ghost towns overnight. Australians found themselves isolated on their island continent, bunkering down for lockdowns that stretched weeks, then months. People sang from balconies, neighbors dropped groceries at doorsteps, and families gathered on video calls instead of in backyard barbecues. Healthcare workers donned masks and gowns, testing thousands each day. The nation's early response kept case numbers low compared to much of the world, but the mental strain was heavy, a reminder that distance is both Australia's greatest protection and its deepest isolation. Yet, even as the world shifted underfoot, the spirit of mateship, that old Aussie word for sticking together, held firm. In the bush, droughts continued to test farmers, drying rivers to cracked beds and turning paddocks to dust. Country towns banded together, fundraising for hay drops, sharing water, and keeping an eye on neighbors who hadn't smiled in weeks. When the rains finally came, they brought relief, and sometimes floods. Such is life on a continent shaped by extremes. Meanwhile, Australia's identity continued to evolve. Debates swirled about becoming a republic, cutting the final ties to the British monarchy. Some waved the Union Jack with pride. Others asked why, in a nation so proudly independent, the head of state still lived in Buckingham Palace. Questions of belonging echo in public life. Who are we? Whose stories matter most? How do we walk forward without leaving anyone behind? Through it all, new voices have risen. Young Aboriginal leaders stand shoulder to shoulder with elders, speaking to Parliament, shaping policy. Refugee advocates remind Australians that compassion should know no borders. Musicians like Baker Boy rap in Yalenga Mata, blending traditional language with modern beats. Writers like Tara June Winch and Bruce Pascoe challenge old narratives, telling stories that place First Nations knowledge at the center of sustainability and identity. And always, the land itself remains the quiet heartbeat beneath the cities and highways. From the rugged Kimberley to the Great Ocean Road, from the misty Daintree rainforest to the wide, star-strewn outback, it whispers reminders that Australia's story is older than any parliament, older than any constitution. Tonight, as you let your eyelids grow heavy, imagine this modern Australia. Crowded train carriages rattling through tunnels under Sydney. Young lovers walking hand in hand along the Yarra River in Melbourne. An elder sitting on red earth, tracing the songlines in the dust for her granddaughter. Surfers paddling into morning waves, while office towers wake with the glow of the rising sun. This nation, flawed, beautiful, restless, is still a work in progress. A place where the dreaming never ended but flows on, pulsing in every eucalyptus tree and every heartbeat that calls this place home. As you drift into dreams, remember, history is never just the past. It is the story we tell ourselves about who we are, and the quiet hope of what we might yet become. Thank you for joining us tonight for Sleepy Time History. You've drifted through Australia's ancient dreaming, its struggles, triumphs, and the vibrant life that flows across this vast sunburnt land. As you rest now, remember that every chapter of history is a reminder. We are all part of a story still being written, shaped by the choices we make and the memories we keep alive. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, please like, comment, and subscribe to Sleepy Time History. Let us know where you're listening from, and which parts of Australia's story spoke to you most. Your support means we can keep exploring the real stories that help you sleep, not so boring, but always gentle enough to carry you to your dreams. Good night, dreamer. Sleep well under the same stars that watched over the first peoples, the settlers, the rebels, and the peacemakers. Tomorrow, we'll travel somewhere new together.